My boyfriend is a looksmaxxing fanatic who preaches about canthal tilt and genetic destiny. I just found his original birth certificate. He's not the stoic alpha he thinks he is. He was adopted, and his biological father is the cringe vegan folk singer he constantly makes fun of online. The paper felt thin and brittle in my hands, like a dried leaf. It was tucked inside a dusty manila envelope labeled keepsakes, buried at the bottom of a storage bin filled with his deceased parents' old tax returns and photo albums. We were supposed to be gathering documents for a mortgage pre-approval, an official adult step forward. Leo had tasked me with finding his social security card and the deed to his parents' house, which he'd inherited. He trusted me with the logistics, the boring stuff, as he called it, while he focused on his optimization protocols. But there it was, folded into a tiny, fragile square, a birth certificate I had never seen before. Not the crisp, modern copy he kept in his file cabinet, but an original, issued by a small hospital 3 towns over. The mother's name was the one I knew, his mother, but the space for the father's name held a name I didn't recognize at all. And then, stamped over the whole document in a faded purple ink, was the word I had to read 3 times to believe: adopted. I heard his keys in the door, a sharp, metallic jangle that always sounded impatient. I quickly folded the paper, my fingers trembling, and shoved it deep into the pocket of my jeans. The weight of it felt like a hot stone against my leg. He walked in, dropping his gym bag with a heavy thud. He didn't say hello to me first. He never did. First, he went to the large, frameless mirror in the hallway, tilting his head from side to side. He sucked in his cheeks, tracing the line of his jaw with his thumb and forefinger. He'd just come from what he called a brutal session, but his hair was perfect and there wasn't a drop of sweat on his brow. He only allowed himself to sweat during the sauna portion of his routine. "Facial symmetry is holding up," he announced to his reflection. Then he turned to me, his eyes scanning me from toe to heel. It wasn't a loving gaze, it was an assessment. "Did you find the documents? I have a consult in an hour with a guy who wants to optimize his life, and I need to project success. A homeowner in his 20s is peak provider genetics." I just nodded, unable to form words, gesturing vaguely toward the pile of folders on the dining table. He grunted in approval and headed for the kitchen, opening the fridge to pull out a murky green liquid in a glass bottle. "You know," he said, taking a loud sip, "I was thinking, we need to cut out the occasional pasta night. The inflammation is suboptimal for your facial definition. We can't have you losing your zygomatic arch." Later that evening, as I was pretending to read on the couch, he let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh my God, you have to see this clown." He turned his phone screen toward me. It was a video of a man with kind, crinkling eyes and a wild nest of graying hair sitting on a stool in what looked like a community garden. He was gently strumming a worn acoustic guitar, singing a surprisingly sweet song about saving heirloom seeds. It's that Barnaby Beecham guy again. The algorithm keeps feeding me his soy-fueled nonsense. Leo's face was twisted in a mask of performative disgust. Look at him! 0 bone mass in his jaw, negative canthal tilt, posture of a wilting kale stalk. This is the end product of a society that celebrates weakness. This is what genetic dead ends look like, babe. My blood went cold. Beecham? The name on the video was Barnaby Beecham, the name I had read just hours before listed under father on that thin, folded piece of paper was Barnaby Alastair Beecham.
I stared at the man on the screen, at his gentle, unassuming face, and then back at Leo, who was still smirking, completely oblivious. The man he considered the absolute antithesis of his entire existence, the punchline to every joke about failed masculinity, was the source of the very genes he worshipped. He took another swig of his green sludge and shook his head. "It's all in the bloodline, you know. You can't escape your legacy. Thank God mine is solid." I felt my mouth go dry. My own legacy. My own bloodline. The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my own head. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the air in the room had been replaced with something thick and heavy, like water. He was still looking at his phone, a smug little smile playing on his lips as he scrolled through the comments on Barnaby Beecham's video. "Look at these people," he scoffed, calling him a gentle soul. "They mean castrated. It's a cope for men who can't compete." I wanted to scream. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to take the birth certificate out of my pocket, unfold its damning creases, and hold it up to his perfectly sculpted, utterly clueless face. But I just sat there, frozen, the throw pillow I was clutching suddenly feeling like a lead weight in my lap. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He finally looked up, catching my expression, his brow furrowed, not with concern, but with critical analysis. "What's wrong with you? Your coloring is off. Are you getting enough iron? I told you that plant-based protein powder isn't as bioavailable." He wasn't asking about my feelings. He was diagnosing a flaw in my biological machine. It was so perfectly him, so perfectly, blindly, tragically him. I managed a weak shake of my head, mumbling something about being tired. It was a pathetic excuse, but it was all I had. He accepted it with a nod, already losing interest and turning back to his phone. "Well, don't let your cortisol spike. It causes water retention in the face. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. Leg day." That night, I lay awake long after his breathing had settled into a deep, rhythmic pattern. The birth certificate was no longer in my pocket. I had moved it, in a moment of sheer panic, to the inside of a book on my nightstand, a collection of poetry I knew he would never, ever open. Even with it hidden, I could feel its presence radiating through the room. I kept replaying the scene in my mind. Leo sneering at the gentle man on the screen, a man who had no idea a son who despised him even existed. I thought about Leo's parents, the ones who raised him. They were kind, quiet people. I'd only known them for a few years before they passed, but I remembered them as soft-spoken and loving. They didn't seem like the kind of people who would subscribe to Leo's rigid, unforgiving worldview. Where had it come from? Had they kept this secret to protect him? Or had they inadvertently created this monster by letting him believe he was the product of their solid lineage, a lineage he had mythologized into something epic and unassailable? Slipping out of bed, careful not to make a sound, I tiptoed into the living room. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor. I opened my laptop, the glow of the screen feeling illicit in the darkness. My fingers trembled as I typed Barnaby Beecham into the search bar. There he was. Dozens of videos, articles from local newspapers about his community garden projects, a simple website with tour dates for coffee shops and small-town folk festivals. I clicked on an interview. He spoke softly, with a slight, self-deprecating humor. He talked about soil health and the importance of biodiversity. He had a goofy laugh that made the corners of his eyes crinkle up. And as I watched, my stomach clenched. It was in the eyes. Not the shape, not the color, but the way they moved, the way they lit up when he laughed. It was Leo. It was a softer, gentler, unoptimized version of the same light I sometimes saw in Leo's eyes, in those rare, unguarded moments before he remembered to be stoic and severe. And his hands. As he gestured, talking about compost, I saw his hands. They were Leo's hands. The same long fingers, the same shape of the knuckles. All this time, Leo had been chasing some idealized genetic phantom, meticulously sculpting himself to match an imaginary blueprint, while the real blueprint was strumming a guitar and singing about heirloom tomatoes, completely unaware. The irony was so profound, it was nauseating. I closed the laptop, my own reflection staring back at me from the dark screen, a ghost in a house of lies.
I had to tell him. But how do you tell a god he was born immortal? The walk back to the bedroom felt like wading through deep water. Every object in our apartment seemed alien, imbued with a new, fraudulent meaning. The minimalist gray sofa, the steel and glass coffee table, the single perfectly angled monstera plant in the corner, it was all part of a stage set for a play Leo was performing, and I was the only one in the audience who'd just been handed a copy of the real script. When I finally slipped back under the covers, the warmth of his body felt foreign. I lay there, rigid, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, and imagined the DNA spiraling inside him, a secret code he spent his entire life trying to crack while throwing away the key. He was a living, breathing paradox, a man who worshipped at the altar of genetics while being completely ignorant of his own. The irony was a physical thing, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. The next morning was jarringly normal. The alarm went off at 6 a.m. sharp, as always. Leo was up instantly, a machine powering on. No snooze, no groans, just efficiency. I watched him through slitted eyes as he went through his routine, scraping his tongue, chugging a liter of filtered water with sea salt, then standing in front of the full-length mirror in his underwear, pinching the skin on his abdomen. Body fat is holding steady at 8.7%, he announced to his reflection. Acceptable, but not optimal. He turned, catching me looking at him. For a split second, before his face settled into his usual mask of critical self-assessment, I saw it again. The crinkle around his eyes. It was Barnaby's crinkle. It was the ghost of a folk singer's smile, and Leo immediately tensed his brow to erase it. I felt a surge of something I couldn't name. It was pity, but it was also a profound sadness. He was at war with himself, with the very essence of the man who gave him life, and he didn't even know it. "You're staring," his voice flat. "Is my facial symmetry off this morning? Sometimes I get fluid retention on my left side if I sleep on it too long." I just shook my head and mumbled, "No, you look fine." The word fine was a pathetic understatement for the man who spent thousands of dollars on supplements and countless hours in the gym to look like a statue carved from granite. But fine was all I could manage. Anything more felt like a lie, and I was already drowning in those. Throughout the day, the secret was a constant heavy presence. It sat between us at the breakfast table while he lectured me on the glycemic index of my oatmeal, and I watched the way his long fingers, Barnaby's fingers, wrapped around his mug of black coffee. It followed me to work, where I stared blankly at my computer screen, the words blurring as I pictured Barnaby Beecham singing to a small crowd in a coffee shop, completely unaware that his son was, at that very moment, probably doing calf raises and listening to a podcast about ancestral diets. The world had tilted on its axis, and only I could feel the shift. My own reality felt thin, like a veil I could poke a finger through. That evening, I found myself rummaging through the storage closet, looking for an old photo album under the pretense of finding a spare phone charger.
My hands were shaking. I needed more. I needed a piece of the past that wasn't a sterile government document. I found a box labeled Leo, Childhood. It was filled with old report cards, a few dusty trophies for track and field, and a kindergarten drawing of a lopsided, smiling sun. And at the bottom, beneath a stack of school photos where a young Leo's smile grew progressively tighter and more forced with each passing year, I found a small, leather-bound baby book. His adoptive mother, Eleanor, had filled it out in her neat, looping cursive. Height, weight, first words. And on the page for favorite things, she had listed the sound of the wind in the trees, bath time, and the funny songs his father makes up on the guitar. I froze. His father? His adoptive father, Robert, was a lovely man, but he was an accountant. He couldn't play a single chord. I'd once asked him about it, and he'd laughed, saying he had all the musical talent of a filing cabinet. My heart started to pound. I flipped through the pages, a desperate hope blooming in my chest. And there, tucked into a small envelope on the last page, was a photograph I had never seen before. It was Eleanor holding a tiny, swaddled Leo. She was younger,
radiant, looking down at the baby in her arms with an expression of pure, unadulterated love. On the back of the photo, in that same familiar script, was a single sentence. "Our little songbird. I hope he always remembers his own tune." My thumb was tracing the edge of the photograph, the paper softened with age. Our little songbird. The words looped in my head, a gentle melody at odds with the percussive, militaristic rhythm of Leo's life. A songbird. It was such a tender, hopeful nickname. It spoke of a future filled with music and light, of a boy who was cherished not for his potential for physical perfection, but for the tune in his soul. I tried to reconcile that image with the man in the other room, the man who measured his food to the gram and considered smiling a waste of facial muscles that could lead to premature wrinkles. The dissonance was a physical ache in my chest. This wasn't just a secret about his parentage anymore. It was about his very essence. Eleanor, his adoptive mother, had seen it. She had held that baby in her arms and heard a song, a melody passed down through his very blood. And somehow, over the years, the world, or maybe Leo himself, had done everything in its power to silence it. I thought of all the times he'd scoffed at my taste in music, calling it unstructured and emotionally indulgent. I remembered the time I tried to get him to go to an outdoor concert in the park, and he declined, saying the potential for sun damage and the lack of nutritional information on the food truck menus was an unacceptable risk. His life was a fortress built to keep out everything that couldn't be quantified, everything that resembled the man who gave him his long fingers and the crinkle in his eyes. He wasn't just ignorant of his father, he was actively at war with everything his father represented. He was fighting a ghost, and the ghost was himself. I carefully placed the photograph back in the envelope and tucked the baby book deep into the box, burying it under a decade of forced smiles and athletic certificates. It felt like burying the evidence of a beautiful, vibrant life that had been tragically cut short. A sudden, sharp laugh echoed from the living room, jolting me back to the present. It wasn't a laugh of joy, it was Leo's laugh of derision, a short, barking sound he made watching videos of people he deemed suboptimal. I closed the closet door with a soft click, my hands trembling slightly. I had to face him. I had to walk back into that living room and pretend that the entire foundation of our reality hadn't just cracked down the middle. I took a deep breath, trying to school my features into a mask of casual neutrality, a skill I was learning from the master. When I stepped into the living room, he was on the sofa, his posture perfect, his laptop balanced on his knees.
He had one of his noise-canceling headphones half on, the other ear free. He didn't look up. "Analyzing case studies," he said, as if that explained everything. "It's fascinating how many men actively choose to broadcast low-status indicators. It's a complete failure of self-awareness." I walked closer, my feet feeling like lead. "What are you watching?" I asked, my voice thin. He gestured to the screen without looking at me. "Just another compilation. Top 10 cringiest performers. It's a masterclass in what not to do. Poor posture, weak vocal projection, beta facial expressions. This next guy is the poster child for it." He finally turned to me, a smirk playing on his perfectly defined lips. "You have to see this. This is the guy I was telling you about, the singing vegan. He looks like he's powered by kale and soy. It's pathetic." My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. He turned the laptop toward me, his eyes gleaming with the cruel certainty of a predator. And there he was, Barnaby Beecham, on a poorly lit stage, singing with his eyes closed, a gentle smile on his face. The video was grainy, clearly filmed on a phone by an audience member, but it was unmistakably him. Leo let out that sharp, dismissive laugh again. "Look at him," he said, pausing the video and using his cursor to circle Barnaby's face. "See the recessed chin, the lack of a defined gonial angle, and the way he hunches over his guitar? It's a physical manifestation of his lack of ambition. He's literally folding in on himself."
He was performing a clinical, brutal dissection of his own father. He was using the very pseudoscientific jargon he lived by to tear apart the man who gave him life, completely blind to the fact that he was pointing a scalpel at his own reflection in a funhouse mirror. I stared at the screen, at Barnaby's kind, crinkled eyes frozen in digital amber, and I felt a wave of nausea so profound I had to grip the back of the sofa to stay upright. I started, but my throat closed up. What could I say? Stop it, you're making fun of your dad? Stop it, that's your chin you're insulting. Leo didn't notice my distress. He was too engrossed in his own superiority. It's just sad, really, he continued, turning the laptop back to himself. Some people are just born with genetic dead ends. Nothing you can do about it. He pressed play, and the sound of Barnaby's gentle, melodic voice filled the space between us, a sound that Leo was dissecting for weakness, while I was hearing it as the most tragic lullaby in the world. I turned and walked toward the bathroom, my movements stiff and robotic. I needed to be somewhere else. I needed to not be in that room, listening to his son unknowingly crucify his own father on a cross of his own making. I locked the bathroom door behind me and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at my own reflection in the mirror, but I saw Eleanor's face, her hopeful smile as she looked down at her baby. I hope he always remembers his own tune. It wasn't a wish. It was a warning. It was the desperate plea of a mother who saw the beautiful, unique song her son was born with and feared that the world would force him to forget the words, to replace his melody with the harsh, dissonant noise of conformity. And it had. He hadn't just forgotten the tune. He was now the one throwing stones at anyone who dared to sing it. The secret was no longer just a piece of information. It was a living thing, and it was suffocating me. The muffled sound of Barnaby's guitar bled through the door, a faint, ghostly melody weaving its way through the hum of the extractor fan. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it a welcome distraction from the fire in my chest. I looked at myself in the mirror again.
My eyes were wide, my skin pale. I looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. In a way, I had. I'd seen the ghost of the boy Leo was supposed to be, the one his mother had called her songbird, and I was now the sole keeper of that ghost's memory. The weight of it was immense. It wasn't just a secret I was keeping from Leo, it was a truth I was keeping for him, a truth that was so antithetical to his entire constructed reality that I feared it would shatter him completely. But my silence felt like a betrayal, too. A betrayal of Eleanor's hope, of Barnaby's unwitting contribution to the world, and of the musical soul that was still buried somewhere deep inside the man in the other room. I took a final, shaky breath and unlocked the door. I had to go back out there. I had to sit in the same room with him and pretend that the air wasn't thick with the most tragic irony I had ever known. When I stepped back into the living room, he had finally closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet again, the silence somehow louder and more oppressive than the sound of Barnaby's song had been. Leo was now meticulously cleaning the screen of his laptop with a microfiber cloth, his movements precise and economical. He glanced up as I approached, his brow furrowing slightly. "You were in there a while. Everything okay?" he asked, his tone more clinical than concerned. It was the same tone he used when asking if I hit my protein macro for the day. "Just a headache," I lied, my voice sounding fragile to my own years. I sat down on the armchair opposite the sofa, putting a deliberate distance between us. I needed space to breathe air that didn't feel like it was entirely his. He nodded, accepting the explanation without question. He wasn't programmed for emotional nuance. A headache was a verifiable physical ailment, an acceptable reason for a deviation in behavior. He folded the cloth into a perfect square and placed it back in its case. "You should hydrate, and maybe check your electrolyte levels. Headaches are often a sign of sodium imbalance." He was trying to help, I knew, but his solutions were always about chemistry, never about comfort. He saw the human body as a machine to be maintained, not a vessel for feelings. I just nodded, watching him. But I was seeing him differently now.
It was like a filter had been lifted from my eyes, and I was noticing details that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. I watched his long, slender fingers as he typed a response on his phone. I had always thought of them as a sign of his disciplined, lean physique. Now I saw them as the fingers of a guitarist. I saw the way he unconsciously tapped his foot to a rhythm only he could hear, a habit I'd always found slightly irritating. Now I saw a ghost of a melody trying to escape. Even the way he furrowed his brow when he concentrated, it was the exact same expression Barnaby had in the photo with Eleanor. He was a collage of a man he didn't know he was, a collection of inherited traits he was desperately trying to optimize and biohack into oblivion. He put his phone down and looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. That video was something, huh? The absolute lack of self-respect. I flinched. The casual cruelty of it, delivered with such certainty, was like a physical blow. I couldn't just nod along this time. The ghost in the room wouldn't let me. "I don't know," I said, my voice quiet but firm. He looked happy. Leo actually scoffed, a genuine bewildered sound. Happy? Happiness is a byproduct of achievement, of moving towards a goal. That man is stagnant. He's wallowing in mediocrity and calling it fulfillment. It's a coping mechanism for genetic inferiority. Each word was a perfectly sharpened dart, and he was firing them into the heart of his own origin story. I felt a surge of protective anger so fierce, it almost choked me. It was an anger on behalf of a gentle-faced man I'd never met, and for a baby nicknamed Songbird. I stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I'm tired," I said, the words feeling like a massive understatement. "I'm going to bed." Leo looked up, surprised by my abruptness. "It's 9:15. Your sleep protocol is optimized for a 10:30 bedtime." He wasn't being controlling. He was just stating a fact from the color-coded schedule of our lives that he'd created. "Well, tonight, my protocol is broken," I snapped, the sharpness in my tone startling both of us. I didn't wait for a reply. I walked into our bedroom and closed the door, leaning against it just as I had in the bathroom. The fortress of his life, the one built on rules and data and contempt for anything soft, suddenly felt like my prison. Lying in bed that night, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing beside me, I pulled out my phone. Under the covers, where the light of the screen wouldn't disturb him, I typed a name into the search bar, Barnaby Beecham. I found his website almost immediately. It was simple, a little dated, filled with pictures of him smiling at small folk festivals and farmers markets, and there was a music player. With trembling fingers, I put in my earbuds, turned the volume down low, and pressed play. As Leo slept beside me, a man who believed music was an indulgent waste of time, I listened to his father sing. The first notes that trickled into my ears were hesitant, just a simple, finger-picked melody on an acoustic guitar. It was clean and unadorned. Then came the voice. It wasn't powerful or polished like a studio musician's. It was gentle, a little reedy, and achingly sincere. It was a voice that sounded like it had lived a life, like it held stories in its timbre. Barnaby Beecham sang about the color of the sky after a storm, about the taste of wild blackberries, about the way a lover's hand felt in his. They were small, simple songs about a world Leo was actively trying to hack, optimize, and conquer. A world he saw as a series of inputs and outputs, not a collection of quiet wonders. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. Lying next to the sun, a man who measured his worth in millimeters of jawline and percentages of body fat, I was listening to the father sing a heartfelt ode to a crooked tree he saw on a walk. It was the most beautiful, tragic thing I had ever heard. I listened for hours, moving through his small online discography. One song, called Unfinished Verse, stopped me cold. It was about a melody that got away, a song he started but could never complete because a crucial piece of it was missing. He sang about a harmony he could almost hear but couldn't quite grasp, a phantom sound that haunted his quiet moments. I knew, with a certainty that made my skin prickle, that he was singing about his son. He was singing about Leo. I had to muffle a sob into my pillow, the kind that convulses your whole body. The man sleeping soundly beside me, a man who believed vulnerability was a fatal flaw, was the missing piece of this stranger's song. He was the unfinished verse. I finally fell asleep just as the sun was starting to bleed light into the sky, with the ghost of his father's melody still echoing in my ears. The next morning felt like a scene from a different life. Our usual routine, the synchronized alarm, the immediate weigh-in, the meticulous doling out of supplements in a shared pill organizer, felt utterly theatrical and absurd. As Leo stood on the digital scale, staring intently at the glowing numbers, I wasn't seeing the chiseled physique he'd spent years building. I was seeing the shape of his shoulders, identical to the silhouette of Barnaby in a photo on his website. I watched him swallow his morning cocktail of zinc, magnesium, and vitamin D, and I saw the way his throat moved, the same vulnerable curve I'd seen in a grainy video of Barnaby singing at an open mic night 20 years ago. Down 0.2 pounds, Leo announced, a note of quiet satisfaction in his voice. The carb cycling is working. My body is responding optimally. I just nodded, my own reflection in the bathroom mirror looking hollowed out and alien. My body was responding too. It was responding with a profound, bone-deep sadness. Later that day, we were in the car, and I had dared to put on the radio, a small act of rebellion against Leo's usual podcast about bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. A soft indie folk song came on, something gentle with a female vocalist and a ukulele. It was innocuous, pleasant background noise. Leo reached over and shut it off without a word. "What was that for?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He sighed, that familiar sigh of a patient teacher explaining a simple concept to a child. "Auditory pollution," he said. "It's unstructured, emotionally manipulative noise. It's designed to trigger a cheap dopamine response without providing any actual value. It's the musical equivalent of junk food." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. A week ago, I would have rolled my eyes. Now I felt a white-hot flash of anger. "Or maybe it's just a nice song, Leo," I said, the words tight and clipped. He glanced at me, his brow furrowed in that way that was so jarringly familiar now. "There's no such thing as just a nice song. It's either optimized for focus, like binaural beats, or it's a distraction." That was a distraction. That night, I couldn't stop myself. As soon as he was asleep, I was back on my phone, the screen a tiny portal into this forbidden world. I moved past the music and found Barnaby's blog. It was called A Quiet Place to Land. He wrote posts about fixing a broken fence, about the migrating patterns of birds, about the importance of community gardens. He wrote with such open-hearted gentleness, with a complete lack of the aggressive, combative certainty that defined Leo's entire online presence. He was everything Leo mocked. He was the soy boy, the beta, the low-T man whose existence was a punchline in Leo's world. And the more I read, the more I realized he was also wiser, kinder, and more profoundly in tune with the world than his son could ever hope to be. I was scrolling back, years and years into the archives, watching the seasons change through his writing, when I found it. A post from 15 years ago. The title was just one word: Eleanor. My heart stopped. My thumb hovered over the link, trembling. I knew I was crossing a line, not just into Leo's past, but into the private grief of a man I'd never met. But I couldn't stop. I clicked. The post was short, just a few paragraphs. It wasn't sad, not exactly. It was wistful. He wrote about a woman he had loved a long, long time ago, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes and a fierce belief in the goodness of people. He wrote about a difficult time, a time when they were young and scared and the world felt too big for them. And then he wrote the sentence that made all the air leave my lungs. "He gave our son a home," he wrote, "a real one, better than the one my restless heart could ever provide. I hope he's out there somewhere. I hope he sings." I slammed the laptop shut, but the words were burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I hope he sings. The four most devastating words I had ever read. I looked over at the man sleeping beside me, his breathing deep and even, his face a mask of serene neutrality in the moonlight. Leo, who considered singing an embarrassing display of unmasculine emotion. Leo, who thought music was a virus that infected the weak-minded. His biological father's one wish for him was that he would participate in the one thing he despised most in the world. The universe had a sense of humor, and it was the cruelest, most twisted joke I had ever heard. I felt like a ghost in my own apartment, like I was watching a play where I was the only one who knew the tragic ending. The weight of it was crushing.
It wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a truth so fundamental it had its own gravity, and it was pulling everything in our lives toward an inevitable collapse. I sat there in the dark for a long time, just watching him breathe, feeling the chasm between the man he was and the man he was wished to be. The next day was a Sunday, Leo's designated active recovery and strategic planning day. This meant a long walk, followed by several hours of him mapping out his meals, workouts, and supplement schedule for the coming week on a massive whiteboard he'd installed in our home office. As we walked through the park, he was critiquing the posture of other men we passed, muttering about forward head tilt and undeveloped traps. Usually, I would tune it out, but today, I couldn't. I kept seeing Barnaby. I saw him in the way Leo's eyes crinkled slightly when the sun hit them, a detail I'd never noticed before. I saw him in the long, delicate shape of his fingers currently curled around his phone as he checked his heart rate, but fingers that looked like they were made to press down on the frets of a guitar. He stopped to point out a particularly tall, broad-shouldered man walking a dog. "Now that's a solid frame," he said, with genuine admiration. "Good clavicle width. His parents gave him a great genetic foundation to build on. My dad always said you can't build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand." He was talking about his adoptive father, a stern, successful investment banker. The words hit me like a physical blow. He was praising the foundation of a life he was given, completely blind to the one he was born with, a foundation not of sand, but of soft earth, of music and poetry and quiet observation. We spent the afternoon in the office. I pretended to answer emails while he stood before his whiteboard, marker in hand, meticulously planning his conquest of the week ahead. He was in his element, a general commanding his tiny army of macros and micronutrients. He was explaining his new theory on the optimal timing for cold plunge exposure to maximize testosterone release when he paused, turning to me. "What do you think is the single biggest failing of modern men?" he asked, as if it were a pop quiz. I just stared at him, my mind a complete blank. "They've lost their ambition," he said, answering his own question. "They've been told to be soft, to be vulnerable, to write poetry or sing about their feelings instead of building something, instead of striving. It's a purposeful weakening of the species." He said it with such conviction, with the absolute certainty of a prophet. He was drawing a direct line in the sand, and on one side was everything he valued: strength, stoicism, ambition, and on the other was a caricature of his own father. That was it. That was the moment the floor fell out under me. It wasn't about the looksmaxxing anymore, or the cringe-worthy jargon, or even his cruelty. It was about the profound, gut-wrenching tragedy of it all. He was a man at war with a ghost he didn't even know existed. He was spending every waking moment of his life trying to obliterate the very essence of the man who gave him life, the man whose deepest wish was for his son to simply have a song in his heart. The anger I'd been feeling for weeks evaporated, and all that was left was a hollow, aching pity that was so immense, it felt like I might drown in it. He wasn't a monster. He was just a lost little boy, echoing the cold philosophies of the parents who raised him, completely unaware of the gentle, loving legacy that was his birthright. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Leo looked over, annoyed by the interruption to his sermon. "I'll be right back," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm and distant to my own ears. I walked into our bedroom, my movements feeling slow and deliberate, like I was moving through water. I went to my closet, to the shoebox tucked away on the top shelf. My hands weren't trembling anymore. I pulled down the box, opened the lid, and took out the folded, official-looking document. I held his entire history in my hands, the paper thin and fragile. I smoothed it out, reading the names one last time. Barnaby Beecham, Eleanor Vance. I folded it carefully and walked back out of the bedroom. He was still standing at the whiteboard, tapping it with his marker, lost in his world of calculated perfection. I stood in the doorway for a second, the birth certificate a cold weight in my palm. I took a deep breath, the kind you take before you dive into ice-cold water, and I prepared to shatter everything. I walked into the office. He didn't look up at first, his focus so absolute, his world so neatly contained on that bright white surface. He was circling his protein intake for Tuesday with a red marker. I didn't say his name. I just walked over and placed the folded certificate on the small sliver of desk not covered by his laptop or a tub of creatine. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was barely audible, but it cut through his concentration like a siren. He finally turned, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "What's this, my tax returns?" he asked, not even looking down. He thought I was interrupting him with a chore. I just shook my head, my throat too tight to form words. I pointed at the paper. He picked it up with a sigh, the kind he reserved for my emotional whims, and unfolded it. I watched his eyes scan the document. I saw the moment of initial confusion, the flicker of dismissal. He probably thought it was a fake, a prank. He looked up at me, a smirk starting to form on his lips. "Okay, very funny. What is this, some kind of novelty gift?" But the smirk died before it was fully born. His gaze dropped back to the paper, to the two names listed under parents, Barnaby Beecham, Eleanor Vance. The names meant nothing to him. They were just ink. He looked at me again, his face a question mark. "I don't get it," he said, his voice flat. And that's when I delivered the final, fatal piece of the puzzle. "Barnaby Beecham," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos raging inside me. "The vegan folk singer, the one you spend hours making fun of on your forums. He's your father, Leo." It was like watching a statue crack. The smug certainty, the unshakable confidence, the entire stoic persona he had spent a decade meticulously constructing, it all just disintegrated in a matter of seconds. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen. The red marker slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. He finally turned, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges, as if he could crush the truth out of existence. He looked from the paper to my face and back again, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading confusion. He was searching for the punchline, for the sign that this was all some elaborate, cruel joke. But he found nothing but sincerity in my expression. I could see the gears in his mind grinding, trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. The man whose entire philosophy was built on genetic destiny, on the superior foundation his parents had given him, was now holding proof that that foundation was a lie. He sank into his desk chair, the movement less a conscious decision than a gravitational collapse. He didn't speak. He just stared at the document, his breathing shallow and rapid. The whiteboard loomed behind him, a monument to a life that had just been rendered meaningless. All his plans, his schedules, his theories on clavicle width and canthal tilt, it was all just noise now. It was the frantic scrawling of a man who never even knew who he was. After what felt like an eternity, he whispered a single word, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "How?" I told him everything. I told him about finding the box, about the letters from his adoptive mother, about the search that led me to Barnaby's blog. And then, because the cruelty of it all demanded to be spoken aloud, I told him about the last thing his father ever wrote about him. I told him about the hope. "He wrote that he hoped you were out there somewhere," I said, my voice breaking. and he hoped that you would sing. That was it. That was the thing that finally broke him. A choked, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sound of such profound agony that it felt like a physical blow. He dropped the certificate on the desk and covered his face with his hands. His broad, genetically gifted shoulders, the ones he spent hours developing in the gym, began to shake. He was a man at war with a ghost, and he had just found out the ghost was himself. I had done it. I had shattered everything. I stood there in the doorway, the architect of his ruin, watching the man I loved mourn the loss of an identity he had clung to like a life raft. He was no longer the stoic alpha, the master of his own destiny. He was just a son, a lost boy who had spent his life running in the exact opposite direction of the home he never knew he had. I had given him the truth, but in its place, I had left a void so vast I didn't know if anything could ever fill it again. Was I right to detonate his life for a truth he never asked for? Or did I just trade a comfortable lie for an unbearable reality? Let us know in the comments.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. I post new stories every day.